Good morning. Excellent. So a quick show of hands. How many of you have read the book? Okay, excellent. All right. Okay, good. I'll run through some of the paradigm. This book was written with Yuri Van Geest, who's my co-author, along with Mike Malone, who has written 20 books, wrote The Virtual Corporation back in the 80s, and has been tracking this paradigm for a long time. Many of you heard my background yesterday, 8 years or so helping build out Singularity. For 2 years before that, I was the head of innovation at Yahoo. And I found that when you try and do disruptive innovation in a large organization, the immune system will come and attack you, right? All of our organizations are built to resist change and withstand change, and we're finding that's actually the high order bit. And so there's some interesting challenges going on in the world today. Every major organization in the world today is facing this challenge. How do you deal with disruptive innovation when you're not architected for it? And I'll talk about what we do about that. I'm actually originally from India, Canadian citizen, holding on to my Canadian passport very carefully these days. I actually spent 10 years in Europe restructuring large European companies, mostly French ones, which is why I'm bald. So if you've interacted with French companies, you'll understand that. Last night in our Meaning of Life session, we offended quite a few constituencies. I'll try and get to the rest in the middle of this talk. Kind of a couple of main points that we want to go through. The first is that when we look at our industries, we tend to categorize them in our perspective in 3 layers. For the vast majority of our history, all of our industries and businesses were very physicalized, right? You took raw materials and you assembled them, added value to them, you moved them around, you sold them, etc. All of the revenue came from the physicality of the material. Then we added a layer like your Kindle or your iPhone, where the product might be physical, but all the revenue streams are information-based and digital, right? And now with the rise of the internet and sensors and so on, we're seeing industries that are completely data-driven with no physical manifestation at all. We write in the book that the Tesla is not really a car with computers and sensors in it. It's a computer that happens to have wheels, right? Which is a completely different paradigm for how you think about it. Actually, one of our alumni told me, you're wrong about that. Remember that it updates itself every 2 or 3 weeks. So you have to think of it as an app that has wheels, and that really kind of breaks your brain. Now, really, the way we still see the world is, for the vast majority, has been very, very physical, with the top of this pyramid touching the information-based paradigm. But little by little, we're now flipping that around. Now we can see most new business models are digitally oriented. Everybody has to figure out how to navigate this digital world. And this is a very difficult transition to make, right? A key way of thinking about this is photography, not the kind of Kodak story that you heard from Peter yesterday, but really the transition. Some of you are old enough to actually remember film photography. You're operating from a material substrate, and you're operating from a scarcity model, right? You can only carry so much film, it takes a few days to get your prints back, etc. When you move to digital photography, when you information enable the paradigm, and the base information, the substrate is now information-based, 3 very important things happen. The first is marginal cost goes to 0. Right? You can now take 1,000 more photographs for the same cost. As a result, the domain explodes. We can now take billions of times more photographs. The third thing that happens that's very subtle, but very relevant from a business perspective, is you shift the business model. So in a film photography world or scarcity world, I may offer courses in photography. I teach people the rule of thirds, composition, et cetera, because they want to optimize each dollar that costs to click the shot. In a digital abundance environment, we all have 8 copies of our photographs on 10 devices, and you can't find anything because it's buried in everything else, right? And when you shift the problem space, the business model changes. The way you make money changes. We saw the same thing in music. When we digitized music, we used to have 8 music studios actually selling physical media, right? The media industry was trying to sell you the CDs, the cassettes, etc. We've digitized that. All 8 studios have disappeared, and we've ended up with roughly 2 platforms, iTunes and Spotify, Pandora, distant third. And so this is a standard transition that we're seeing in more and more industries, where we're moving to this digital environment where more and more of our revenue streams are operating this particular way. Peter took you through kind of these 4 paradigms yesterday. When you digitize, it becomes highly disruptive. We then demonetize that, et cetera, et cetera. I mentioned yesterday in one of the side events that we're 12 billion internet-connected devices today, going to 1 trillion. I find that statistic quite extraordinary. You know, if we think we're 30, 40 years into the information revolution, in the next few years, we'll get to 1 trillion internet-connected devices. From 12 billion to 1 trillion means we've just crossed 1%. We were literally just starting this transition. Most of this disruption is ahead of us, as opposed to behind us. We now can digitize all sorts of fascinating things. Some of you heard of Beyond Verbal. Is Yuval here somewhere? The CEO is here. These guys can take a 10-second clip of your voice, and just by analyzing the tonal variation, they can assess your mood and your underlying attitude to an 85% accuracy. Customer service teams are using this today. If an angry customer calls, what's the underlying attitude? You know, can you save the account, or should you just hang up the phone, move on to the next one because you've lost them anyway, right? You can actually download this app called Moody's if you want to try this out. Try this out on your spouse if you want to have an interesting discussion about their mood. That one doesn't really go so well. But it starts to get really weird. Last year I was speaking at one of our CNBC conferences that Will put together. And while I was on stage, one of our alumni taped 13 seconds of my voice, Arjun somewhere, who's here in the audience somewhere, and he showed it to the audience. So that was my mood and my underlying attitude as I was speaking on stage, right? That gets a little eerie. We're actually going to do an event during the presidential debates this fall. When the candidates are speaking, we'll have a ticker saying, here's what they're really thinking. Unfortunately, we didn't have this a year ago. It would have kind of solved many of the country's problems if we had, would have winnowed down the field. But think about this. Think about the idea that once you have cameras that can record facial twitches, in about 4 or 5 years, it will be impossible to lie. Right? So that's going to have an interesting impact. If you're in marketing, you have to be a little careful. Most of our politicians pretty much have to resign, right? Because that's a professional requirement, and what happens when you get rid of that, right? How do we deal with the world? And how will the world absorb that capability that we've never kind of seen before? So you can see this disruption is kind of highly kind of disruptive in this sense. And as we saw yesterday, and we'll see a lot of today, this disruption is now happening across a dozen technologies. We now have about a dozen technologies all accelerating and doubling in their price performance. We have never seen so many technologies move so fast. And as they intersect, that intersection adds a whole other multiplier effect, right? One way we frame this in the 1500s, we had the Gutenberg moment. The printing press changed everything. Today, it's like we have about 30 Gutenberg moments happening at the same time. And this is putting enormous stress on our societies, as we talked about a bit yesterday, and our businesses. Now, from an economic perspective, there's 2 very important things happening. The first is the volatility and kind of the rapidity of this. The metabolism of the economy is accelerating. It used to take like 20 years to create $1 billion marketplace. We're seeing that happen in months. But this is the curve that's very interesting. This is the newspaper business. When we went fully digital end-to-end, you tend to see this deflationary cliff take place. A 6x drop in revenues as eBay, Craigslist kind of sort of bit. This is the music business. I mentioned that already. A 10x drop in that industry. That cliff, if you're familiar with this, is hitting the TV business right now, right? Media buying is catching up to the reality that very few people are watching ads. And the younger generation's barely watching TV at all. And it speaks to this curve that it's so hard to spot this. Peter touched on this yesterday. I really want to highlight how difficult it is to spot this exponential growth. Our cognitive ability is very impaired in trying to deal with this. When the Google car first came out, the cost of the LiDAR, GPS sensors, radar added up to about $200,000 a car. And a lot of car companies looked at that and said, cute research project, but you're never commercializing that. 2 years later, it was down to about $80,000 a car. And they said, all right, it's a bit better, but no consumer will pay for that. And we're now below $1,000 a car, right? And everybody's kind of freaking out. This is the solar energy graph that Ramez showed you yesterday. The cost of solar modules literally plummeting off a cliff. In 2003, the leading expert in solar in the world said this. He said, look, if you add up the cost of the silver, the wiring, the glass, etc., you will never drop below $1 a watt. It's just a physical reality around it. You can see the market actually believed him for a little bit. Then it started dropping, kept dropping. We hit 50 cents a watt in 2014. We were down at about half that point, and his latest comment is here at the bottom. He said, okay, getting below $1 has exceeded my expectations, right? And Peter is fond of saying that an expert will tell you how you cannot do something, because the models they're operating off are kind of out of date. In many of these domains, when an expert in an industry makes a prediction in an exponentially growing market, they're off by about 10x. It's a pretty standard. This is not a math error. This is clearly a cognitive error. And we have repeated examples of this. The kind of the reason for this inexorable pace of change is really the sheer democratization of this. As Peter mentioned yesterday, Google is the same for Larry Page as it is for any farmer in Africa. Today, any entrepreneur, I mentioned this at the end of yesterday, any entrepreneur can go into a legacy business with a beginner's mind, leverage new technologies, and totally disrupt the status quo. Right? And whether it's drones or Bitcoin or whatever, they're all going through this pace, this kind of curve. A domain becomes digital, the costs go to zero, you get open source communities forming, and then you get a radical disruption in the status quo. And all of these technologies that we're tracking are going through roughly this pattern. Right? The money leaves the system, you have extraordinary enablement of individuals, and then you disrupt the status quo pretty dramatically. Bitcoin and blockchain are classic examples of this. Now, we can see all this disruption on the outside. We can see that happening in front of us. But on our inside of our businesses, Yuri put this chart together showing every part of our internal sides of our business are also radically changing. Sales and marketing is almost completely digital now, right? There's almost no analog component left to it. But this is the quote that really got me. David Rose, one of our faculty, made this comment that all of our organizations are architected for efficiency and for predictability. And you heard that from John Hagel a little bit later. We're all architected for this environment. And John and his partner, John Seeley Brown, have done a lot of thinking around how do we deal with the scalable efficiency that we try and achieve in many of our organizations. Think about the idea that every MBA program in the world teaches you how to build an organization for the 20th century, right? You take a core capability, you get supply chain automation, you get back-end ERP systems, you try and sell the same widget in 100 countries in a completely standardized way. Yet the world is changing very, very dramatically in front of us. The reason we wrote the book, we looked at this idea that we've learned how to scale technology very well. How do you scale the actual organization structure, which has always been painfully incremental and linear and sublinear as you get larger? Yet in the last 5 years, we found a new breed of organization that is actually scaling the org structure as fast as we can scale technology. And we call these exponential organizations. The minimum benchmark is they're achieving a minimum 10x performance improvement compared to their competitors. Right? So minimum 10x compared to their competitors. An easy example would be if you're a typical car company, you have about 800 different parts in the drivetrain. A Tesla has 17, right? So there's a very dramatic change in there. And so on multiple segments, so as I mentioned, we've now kind of tracking this pattern. We've now found over 100 organizations operating like this. Over 100 organizations are operating where they're leveraging new capabilities to deliver 10x performance improvements compared to their peers. And the simple question is, how are they doing it? You know, what are the mechanisms and techniques they're using to do this? We've kind of analyzed this inductively and found there's kind of 3 buckets of reasons and techniques that they're using. The first is they all have what we call a massive transformative purpose, right? Google, go organize the world's information. Singularity, go impact 1 billion people positively. XPRIZE, radical breakthroughs for the effective technology, positively affecting humanity. Brands are starting to morph into this. Coca-Cola's recent mantra has been this, right? Open happiness. Their old mission statement would have been, you know, sell lots of sugar waters through highly leveraged distribution chains and add value to our ecosystem of vendors, suppliers, partners. And nobody inside Coke would know what that was. If you have a typical mission statement, nobody inside your company can repeat it, right? But everybody inside Google knows that. So it acts as a North Star. It answers Simon Sinek's question of why are you there, has a social purpose wrapped into it. We were talking to Paul Pullman, the global CEO of Unilever. The book is now the operating manual for him, P&G, Caterpillar, and a bunch of others. He has ordered every brand in Unilever to take on an MTP. So we're starting to see this meme sort of catch on. So this is a massive purpose that every single exponential organization has one that we've seen. Then there's 5 externalities that we use to scale outside the organization. Uber doesn't hire its own staff. TED uses community. Google uses algorithms. Airbnb is leveraging other people's assets. And then there's new digital engagement models, gamification, incentive prizes, et cetera, et cetera. Then 5 internal mechanisms, right? Real-time dashboards, the whole lean startup methodology, How many of you are familiar with the lean startup methodology, right? Many of you, hopefully, excellent. Turns out it doesn't work so well for startups, but it works really well if you have existing processes that you need to iterate quickly, right? The whole autonomy discussion where we're decentralizing our organization structures. Companies like Zappos are trying to do this. How many are familiar with Valve software? Right? Valve is a software company out of Seattle of about 500 people. No CEO, no reporting lines, no job descriptions, no management meetings, no middle management layers of any kind. They literally operate like a beehive. So if there's a bug in the software, I grab 3 people that I think can solve the bug, we go fix it, we disband. Everybody self-selects as to what they want to do. They get more revenue per employee than Microsoft by doing this. And if you think that's a cute Silicon Valley company or a gaming company, go look up Haier, the Chinese appliance manufacturer. They make 55 million fridges and ovens a year. And 10 years ago, the CEO looked at his org structure, decided, I can't meet my corporate goals with this, blew it up. He had 80,000 people working in a classic pyramid siloed type structure like many of our organizations, turned 80,000 people into 2,000 autonomous teams. Each team elects their own leader, each team decides whatever they want to do. You would think that making 55 million fridges and ovens would require a lot of central coordination, demand planning, forecasting, supply chain management. Turns out you don't. And the reason is that if you have the kind of the new breed of social technologies, Slack, Yammer, Chatter, etc., we now know very well that horizontal communication patterns in our organizations are much more valuable than horizontal ones, right? And if you can enable horizontal communication patterns effectively, you don't need the vertical management structure. Okay? Actually, my socks are actually Slack socks. There you go, from a present from Stuart. There you go. And so kind of we're starting to see this totally new breed where we're kind of trading and socializing the inside of the business, allowing us radical change. Now, not everybody does all of these, right? If you're running an oil rig, you're probably not experimenting that much. You want to kind of do the same thing over and over again. But if you implement 4 out of the 10 will improve your organization effectiveness by 10x, right? So we're kind of advising a lot of companies as to how to do that. Yuri and I went on Squawk Box a year ago, and we actually took what we've done is created a survey that's in the book on how you score your own organization structure. How do you kind of rank yourself and grade the flexibility of your own org structure? What we did was we took the Fortune 100 and we scored them based on their org structure, and here's the ranking. So this is the Fortune 100 ranked by how flexible is the organization, right? And we'll give you these slides, by the way. At the top, a lot of digital companies. At the bottom, a lot of energy companies, which traditionally would make sense. If you're shipping natural gas across the country, you're doing the same thing over and over again. You don't need a lot of variation in the org structure. But if solar energy is coming along, you'd better figure it out. Right? The most interesting thing was that Hult Business Schools did a stock market analysis and a research project. They found that your stock market performance correlates directly to how flexible your organization is. Right? It starts to make sense. As the external world becomes more volatile, your ability to adapt to it will drive market performance. Okay? And so this starts to become an interesting indicator around where things go. In terms of the second half of the book, it becomes prescriptive. How do you build one of these? But the really big challenge we thought we wanted to tackle was how do you apply this to existing legacy organizations? Right? What do you suggest to existing legacy enterprises to deal with this? We have 2 major pieces of suggestions. The first is update your leadership that this is a new world. If your C-suite and your board are not aware we're in a fundamentally new paradigm, you're going to be behind the 8 ball, right? And you've seen some of the statistics around the work that we've been doing. This is a survey of bank executives who were asked, how familiar are you with disruptive startups? Take, say, Lending Club here, right? Multi-billion-dollar public company doing peer-to-peer loans. 45% of bank executives have never heard of it, right? That's criminal negligence. You have no business determining strategy for your organization if you have no idea that this exists, right? If you operate in any kind of traditional large organization, think about the idea that 99% of the conversation in the organization is about what's happening inside, very little about what's happening outside. Yet today, the external world is really the higher order driver, and all disruptive innovation is happening outside. You see a lot of organizations kind of turning themselves inside out, creating partnerships with startups and listening environments, scouting programs here in Silicon Valley, etc. The second major suggestion is do not do this at home. If you try and take a legacy organizational structure and do one of these massive business transformation projects, they usually fail. 80% or so will fail. They cost a ton of money, they take a very long time, and they're highly, highly political. Our strong suggestion, and you'll hear more from John about this, is how to go set up these things at the edge. Okay? Larry Page came to me a few years ago at one of our Singularity events and said, hey, your incubator at Yahoo was very successful. Should I do that at Google? And I said, no, you'll have the same immune system problem that we did, but set up something similar pointed outwards, right? And you see the result with Google X, where they've taken their core organization, information management capabilities, added hardware to it, and are now kind of radically pushing the borders with Google Loon, Google Car, Google X, et cetera, and they have created the moonshots idea, which is basically a massive transformative purpose. You can see that happening. The master of this technique is actually Apple. Apple has built a hyper-successful company, and yeah, they have a great design capability and a great technology supply chain. I will argue that their real innovation is actually organizational. What Apple does, unlike any other company in the world, is they'll take a small team that's very, very disruptive, take it to the edge of the organization, keep it totally stealth, and then they'll say, go disrupt another industry. Right? Nobody else does this. They started with what, music, and then phones, and then tablets, and now payments and cars and watches and healthcare. There's no limit to their market cap. They can just keep knocking over industry after industry. As we enter a world where either you're the disruptor or you're the disrupted, most large organizations will have to follow suit and do something similar to this. And many of you are doing that aggressively today. So that's kind of the structure that we suggest for large organizations. A couple of war stories. You know, we're seeing some really fascinating tensions out in the world today. I mentioned Yahoo, this immune system problem. At Yahoo, the fundamental problem was 10 years ago, the CEO, by accident, implemented a classic matrix structure. Products on the verticals and all the horizontals with branding, marketing, PR, et cetera. When you have that kind of a structure and you try and do anything, it takes time. You have to kind of cross all these layers, get ticked off by legal and branding, et cetera. And the structure disincentivizes risk-taking. The legal guy wants the same terms of services all across all properties. He doesn't want a rogue property doing something differently. Well, if you're on the internet, the two attributes you better have are speed and risk. So the org structure is antithetical to the industry they're in. And the board was never able to figure that part out. Nespresso is a success story where they have Nestle, they took a small team, set it off at the edge, and we've seen the dramatic success of Nespresso, funded separately. The CFO had no say in how that organization was funded. Actually, they told me they made one mistake with Nespresso. They kind of did all the things right, but they forgot to keep it stealth. And they mentioned to me at a session we did at Vevey that in the entire 3 years of the development of Nespresso, all the executives spent all their time trying to kill it, right? Actually, a great story for this is Walmart. Walmart 10 years ago realized they had to compete with Amazon. So they set up a team and said, go in Bentonville and said, go leverage our distribution inventory systems, et cetera, and let's go create an e-commerce capability. Within 18 months, the immune system had killed it, dead. So they said, okay, let's do it again. Let's set up the team at the edge, right? So they started this team at the edge, but they said, we'll still leverage our existing environment because we have the best systems in the world. 18 months later, that was dead. So they did it a third time. They said, okay, let's do it again, but go create a separate inventory supply chain distribution systems. Even though we have the best in the world, you need the independence. They realized that. Hugely courageous decision. It started to succeed. The business pulled it back in too early and killed it. And it was on the fourth iteration. Think about the careers lost, the churn, the money spent, the time, the opportunity cost. On the fourth iteration, they did it separately, independently, separate supply chain, and only after it achieved critical mass did they start stitching the back ends together. And the lesson I take from this is just really, really hard. As a business community, we've never had to deal with this extraordinary change on the outside, driving radical. We just don't have the skills internally. And in any large organization, if you try and drive change internally, you know, how many of you have done corporate innovation, right? Okay, I can spot you with the arrows you have in your backs from dealing with that, right? A very difficult environment. And so extraordinary to see what's happening there. A key thing that we're doing right now in partnership with both Singularity and some of the companies that are out there is we're doing a 10-week sprint. We actually piloted this last year with the largest CPG company in the world. We've come up with a 10-week process that moves your organization thinking and your senior leadership thinking 3 years ahead in 3 months. We've run this now 3 times and it works amazingly well. What we've actually done is we've solved the immune system problem in large organizations. Okay? Tomorrow I'll be doing a talk on how we've taken this approach and actually applied it to cities and solving problems that cities are occurring. And Rodrigo from the One Laptop Per Child project is here to talk about that. So we'll mention about how do you take this process and apply it. But we think we've actually cracked the immune system problem. And so we're very excited about this capability in this case. I'll leave you with this story. We look at executives in the world and we find that I've probably spoken to 500-600 C-suite execs in Fortune 1000 companies over the last few years, with Yuri and myself talking to lots of companies. We found basically they bifurcate into 2 buckets. 80% have no idea this is happening. 60% have no idea of what you've heard yesterday and today. And out of this 20 out of the 80 that have heard about it, they kind of go, oh yeah, not in my industry. You may feel disruption over there, but not over here. We're too different, etc. That leaves like 20%. Of the 20% that realize their industry will be heavily disrupted, 15 out of the 20 literally do nothing because their pay packages have got about a year left in the contract. They have no incentive to do short-term change to the organization to affect short-term market price. That leaves 5% of Fortune 1000 companies that we think are doing the right thing. The GEs, the Unilevers, et cetera, et cetera. That's a pretty small ratio. So this idea that 40% of the Fortune 500 may disappear, we think it's going to be much, much worse than that. And I want to just end with this and then we'll move on. Santiago Bilinkis, who's here somewhere in the audience, one of our alumni from Argentina, noticed about 3 years ago that if you own a car wash in Buenos Aires, you've seen a 50% drop in revenues over the last few years, okay? So if you own a car wash in Buenos Aires, there's been a 50% drop in revenues. And he's looking at this and he says, this makes no sense. The middle class has exploded. We have a ton more luxury cars. Argentinians are very proud. They like to keep their cars clean. If anything, you should see a doubling or tripling of revenues. Now think about the car wash industry. What do you think might disrupt the car wash industry? And it's not obvious, right? It kind of doesn't occur. How do you digitize that? It's not really that obvious. Pretty traditional bricks and mortar business. So he spent 3 months researching this, trying to understand, is it legal issues? Is there water restrictions? Is there hyper competition? Is there regulatory? What's going on? Why is there such a huge drop? And he was able to get rid of all of the obvious factors, and he finally found the answer. The answer turned out to be that because of the increased computational power, literally because of Moore's law, our ability to model the weather has become a lot better. And the weather patterns in Argentina and Buenos Aires lend themselves to modeling very well. And over the last 6-8 years, we're literally 50% better at knowing when it's going to rain. And when you know it's going to rain, you don't wash your car. Right? So here's a completely orthogonal effect. The computational power driving better modeling of weather. You know when it's going to rain, you don't wash your car. If you're the poor car wash owner, it does not matter how smart you are. You're not figuring that out. Right? Because you're kind of looking at the competition and other things. There's a we call this the orthogonal effect of information, where a breakthrough in one area has an unexpected result. Now, 50% drop in revenues is kind of a big body blow, right? You might as well shut up the organization and go home in many cases. And we think this is going to happen in pretty much every industry. So your chance today is to really assume this is happening. That should be your kind of paranoid starting point, and then decide what will you do about it. Okay. So with that, let me pause there. Thank you very much for having me. Great to have you here.